All right. Hello, everyone. I'm Ivan. I'm an undergraduate student at Waterloo, our University of Waterloo. And today I'm going to be telling you about, I guess, this discovery that in Linear, specifically with this orbium creature, but in other creatures as well, we kind of find a fractal parameter space that is very interesting to explore. Um, and one note is that I'll kind of start, like, I'll say the result in the first 30 seconds, and then the rest will be kind of like motivation for why is this actually the result. And I think that's kind of the more interesting thing here. That's why the title kind of is like a mismatch. But we'll start with, actually, is the same place one of the talks yesterday started, because our research kind of branched from the same thing. And that's that this kind of like offhand observation in this paper by Kojima and Ikegami in 2023 was that in this, the regular linear organisms, they found that a pattern would actually disappear if you made it more accurately simulated or use a basically smaller time step, as well as using a bigger one, which is kind of unexpected, right? And I actually tried to replicate this result and I did not get that result. I was like, why is this happening? Turns out I was using like a slightly different approximation of this growth function. And if I like plotted it, they're like almost exactly the same, but not really, right? So there's this like tiny difference that was making a huge difference in their experiments, right? And yeah, basically I was like, okay, what if I tried to plot one of these parameters changing while the time step parameter is changing as well? Because maybe for different growth functions, which are parameterized by this mu and the sigma parameter, we can observe the same kind of thing where we kind of go from working until infinity as far as we can tell, and working only for like this specific region in space. So you get these kind of like weird 2D maps, which don't look that interesting yet, but if you scale them up, you get something that looks like this, which is much more higher resolution and kind of gets you excited, right? And this doesn't just hold when you plot against time, right? So here I'm actually on the left side of these, you'll see the time step is we're taking like bigger steps. So these are more discrete, and this is where you'd actually expect it to be kind of less accurate. So that's kind of the intuition for why these are complex. But it turns out that it's also complex if you just plot the regular parameters against each other. So if you take the growth function and then you squish it or you move it around in different ways, which is this like mu and sigma, or you take the kind of the spatial scale and you move it around. In all of these, you get this same thing happening where you get this very complex shape coming out of nowhere. And what that actually reminded me a lot of, oh yeah, and these also have this like scale, right, where you can zoom in practically infinitely up until basically floating point precision errors start to be the biggest factor. And you still get the same kind of structure. And this last image, which is like the super zoomed in thing, looks a lot like this result from Yasha Sol-Dickstein earlier this year, which was basically showing that the boundary for neural networks on whether they're trainable or not is actually also in this kind of fractal structure. So that's very interesting. And it might not seem that apparent based on the formulas yet, but if you really take a closer look, you have a something t and then a something t plus 1 on the other side, and then you have a plus sign or a minus sign with the big fancy equation. But the point is you have this thing that you're iterating kind of indefinitely. And another place where we do this a lot is in fractals, right? So in fractals, we take a much simpler function, admittedly, and just kind of iterate it until usually it's until we diverge or we just want to stop plotting because it gets too complicated. But yeah, there's this common theme of like kind of iteration of a relatively simple function until something unexpected happens. And the argument I will kind of tried to make is that the intuition you should have for when fractals appear is based on these two things, which is whether the function is computationally reducible. So for example, if you were to analytically kind of show the expansion of something that yields the Mandelbrot set, right? It's just taking a square, adding something, taking a square, adding something. If you were to kind of analytically expand that, that'd be like an infinitely growing sequence. And you simply can't write that in any simpler form. And the same kind of holds, not very rigorously, but you can kind of see the same things happening in linear, and you can and with neural networks as well, where you have this kind of iteration of a function. And also the thing we seem to see is that fractals appear when you have infinite sensitivity to initial conditions or arbitrary sensitivity, which, I mean, it's almost obvious, but still very important to say because somewhat obviously, if you zoom in infinitely, there's a tiny change that you can make that will still give you a different result, right? And actually, my current hypothesis is that maybe these are kind of the same thing. I haven't found a mathematical theorem. Maybe someone actually knows of such a thing, but it seems pretty plausible to me that we could actually kind of equivalently state these mathematically, but we'll take them as two separate things that will, if we see these, we should expect to see a fractal, essentially. And yeah, the second part of the talk is going to be like intuition number 2, which is, okay, once we have a fractal, can we do anything with that, right? So we seem kind of screwed if our search space is like this super complicated thing that is mathematically shown to have like infinite complexity. So what can we possibly do? But I guess I'll show like a very simple example of this not really being the case. So what I have here is a plot from I showed you earlier, but zoomed in high resolution. And this is the mu and the sigma parameter being plotted. And the color is how long the creature survived. And I just cut that off at some specific value. And what we're interested, I guess, in seeing is what parts of this parameter space yield interesting things, not interesting things, because we'll see that some of these are fairly trivial, or some of these near the boundaries will have this like weird wobbling and they'll kind of blow up. But we can still make some kind of generalizations. So I'd imagine if you're looking at this, you'd see kind of like an island shape, right? And that mathematically doesn't mean much, or I guess not very rigorous, but as humans, we're pretty good at, if I put you in the center of this island, you'd probably start off there, wander off to the coast, and then start kind of doing like a loop around the coast and maybe make a pretty good map of that. We have a lot of experience doing that as humans. And clearly we've already done better than random search and making a pretty good plot of this island. Even though I just told you that this is a super complex fractal boundary, which we can't mathematically describe, but it's still essentially compressible. So we can say something about it in a simpler way. So here I'll show kind of where we find interesting things happening. So what I found is this first island kind of corresponds to the original Linea orbium, which is this one most famous creature, and it's what I'm studying here. But essentially, if you take that and you change the parameters of the growth function and plot it out here, and let's say you go all the way out to the extreme over there, you're going to get this really wobbly thing that if you change it a little bit, it's going to be completely unstable. But it does survive, as indicated by that like yellow color there, right? And so if we go close to these like kind of these like really complex boundaries, we get things that are very different and based on very small perturbations. So we get, for example, another species entirely located actually quite close to the original orbium parameters. And that is also kind of on that chaotic boundary. And in this huge part in the corner here, this is essentially trivial patterns. Like we can pretty safely say that anywhere I go into here, it's going to give me something that looks like those like dark red dots, which is these like stable patterns that we usually try to avoid when breeding like interesting creatures. So basically I've been able to give you a fairly high level overview of this fractal structure without kind of running into problems of it being infinitely complex. Also, another thing that we can probably do, we can do, is kind of plot heuristics over this fractal space. And I'll show that using some of these, you can actually differentiate different creatures based on complexity, which is kind of like a very difficult problem right now, is how do we have a good heuristic for what is interesting? So we can do something like total mass, which is probably the most common one used, which is, did it completely disappear, or did it explode and reach like fill up the whole screen and not do anything super interesting? Another thing that I've been working on, which I'm not aware of any other work on this, but is construct like a Lagrangian, which is not so easy to do in regular linear, but in asymptotic linear, where it's a differential equation, it's quite nice to do that. So that kind of gives you a characteristic value that you can plot. And approximations of the entropy. We can't actually measure the entropy of the entire thing in like a meaningful way, but we can do things that estimate entropy or the number of bits we need to represent it using PNG or gzip, or counting like grids of 3x3 cells and getting the entropy of that distribution. So here I'll plot the compression ratio of different parts of that mu sigma, the growth function parameter space. And what you can see here is clearly that part that I said was mostly trivial stuff, not super exciting, those like circles, and is very different from the part where we get all of those like orbium variations. And this isn't really something we're able to visualize quite nicely, but I think these fractal diagrams actually give you a pretty good intuition for this. So we can actually just simply threshold it and say, okay, actually all of the interesting species in this region roughly live somewhere here. And yeah, this kind of leads me to, if intuition one was that we tend to see fractals in things that are irreducible and that are like infinitely sensitive to initial conditions. What we can also do is if we see a fractal space, it doesn't mean that it's infinitely complex, and it's actually going to be quite compressible, and we can use heuristics to kind of explore it in a more meaningful way. And yeah, we can essentially exploit these and do better than random for search. So combining intuition 1 and 2, we can essentially look for specific parts of that fractal space where we can get, for example, these non-platonic creatures. If you watched the talk yesterday, these like really weird wobbly things that don't look like they should exist. Can also kind of identify, instead of saying that this specific initial state and this parameter set is this creature, now we can say that there's actually a continuous distribution or region in this space that all corresponds to the same family of creatures. And we can actually morph in between these, as I kind of show that there's like different creatures inside the same space. And although I haven't done this yet, I think there's a lot of potential in improving on evolutionary search algorithms. So like I showed you, visualizing the space of kind of heuristics over the parameter space actually gives you interesting places to explore, which both algorithms and like just your intuition can help you guide where to explore. And also, yeah, you can use those heuristics to kind of differentiate between complex life forms and yeah, I guess give you like an actual scalar value that says how interesting or complex is this thing. So yeah, that's it.